Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to be taking a journey into the realm of early aviation history by exploring one of the most ambitious and unconventional aircraft ever built, the Junkers G-38. Designed in the late 1920s, the G-38 earned its reputation as the giant airliner that offered passengers accommodations not just in a central fuselage, but also inside its massive wings. It was a technological marvel that embodied the bold spirit of innovation, and it left an indelible mark on the evolution of commercial flight. Join me as we uncover the captivating story of this extraordinary aircraft and see how its legacy influenced decades of aviation progress. In the early decades of the 20th century, aviation was still finding its footing, so to speak. Aircrafts were rapidly transforming from flimsy single-engine biplanes into robust multi-engine machines that promised to redefine what was possible in air travel. Against this backdrop, Junkers, a pioneering German aerospace company, stood at the forefront of innovation. The company's founder, Hugo Junkers, was a visionary engineer whose work helped set the foundation for modern aeronautics. From designing the world's first all-metal passenger aircraft to championing the monoplane wing design, Junkers dared to go where few other firms were willing, even if it meant challenging convention at every turn. During the 1920s, the idea of large commercial aircraft with ample passenger capacity started to gain traction. Airlines like Imperial Airways in Britain and Deutsche Lufthansa, commonly referred to as Lufthansa, in Germany, recognized the potential profitability of carrying more people across greater distances at higher speeds and in greater comfort than ever before. While most manufacturers took incremental steps to scale up their designs, Junkers decided to make a radical leap: the G-38. The G-38 was not merely about size. Its design was meant to redefine how passengers experienced flight. In that era, flying was perceived as somewhat glamorous but still highly uncomfortable. Pressurization was a distant dream, and cabin noise was significant. There was also the matter of reliability, as engine malfunctions were common. Junkers believed that if they could build a massive rugged aircraft with enough power, they could elevate the entire passenger experience. By 1928, preliminary designs for the Junkers G-38 were all complete. The project demanded complex engineering solutions. The proposed wingspan was larger than virtually any commercial airliner at the time, and the aircraft would have to integrate cutting-edge all-metal construction tech. Now, Junkers engineers faced numerous challenges, including structural integrity issues, engine mounting, and the incorporation of passenger compartments into the wings without compromising aerodynamic efficiency or safety. Every challenge was met with a combination of scientific rigor and creative problem-solving, forging a blueprint that was as iconic as it was audacious. From the beginning, the G-38 was envisioned as a massive metal bird, relying on thick wings to generate necessary lift and offer enough structural volume for passenger accommodations. In a period dominated by biplane designs and lightweight wooden structures, the G-38 stood out as a mammoth undertaking. It was to be a four-engine behemoth, although the engine configuration would shift during its developmental stages. The boldness of the G-38's concept resonated with Lufthansa, which was eager to operate high-profile trans-European routes. Lufthansa's leadership saw in the G-38 a chance to showcase German engineering prowess and offer an unprecedented level of passenger comfort, effectively setting themselves apart from other airlines at the time. Enthusiasm was high, expectations were enormous, and budgets, though always a limiting factor, were allocated for the project because of the potential payoff: a new standard of air travel that could carry the airline industry into the next era of flight. All of these factors converged into a singular vision: build the world's largest land-based airliner, one that would merge innovative design with robust engineering. Once the initial blueprint was approved, work commenced in earnest to bring the G-38 from the drafting table to the skies. By the time the G-38 concept had gathered momentum, Junkers was already a well-established name in aviation circles. The company had produced numerous successful aircraft that introduced all-metal airframes and advanced aerodynamics to a world still learning the basics of powered flight. The G-38 included several innovations that would eventually become the pillars of Junkers' corporate identity. Firstly, Junkers popularized the use of monoplane cantilever wings, eschewing external struts and bracing wires. This reduced drag and improved the structural integrity of the aircraft. Additionally, previous Junkers designs like the Junkers F-13 and the Junkers Ju-52 featured corrugated aluminum alloy skin to add rigidity and strength. Although the G-38 didn't use corrugations to the same extent, the tradition of metal skin construction was still integral to its design philosophy. Junkers was also a pioneer in creating enclosed cabins for both crew and passengers, offering greater protection from the elements and a more pleasant flying experience. This placed them ahead of many other manufacturers of the time who clung to open cockpit designs. Lastly, Hugo Junkers was a professor and an engineer who grounded his company in rigorous scientific methods. Wind tunnel testing, advanced metallurgy, and theoretical calculations were all standard practice. This was remarkable for an era when aviation was often an experimental, seat-of-the-pants affair. The G-38 would be the ultimate expression of Junkers' technical prowess. The giant wing structure would have to be strong enough to support not only fuel and engines, but also crew and passengers in compartments carved into the thick airfoil. The fuselage would need to seamlessly integrate with the wings, creating a unified aerodynamic body that minimized drag. And the 4 engines, initially planned as 2 pairs of tandem wings, would have to deliver enough thrust to lift this flying colossus off the ground while maintaining reliability and safety. Junkers also had a reputation for forging strong relationships with airlines and governmental bodies. Lufthansa was deeply interested in operating the G-38 for long-distance routes that connected major German cities with international destinations. There was excitement about potentially using it for routes spanning from Europe to the Middle East or even further. The G-38 was more than just another aircraft. It was perceived as a game-changer that could dominate the skies and show the world that Germany was leading the way in commercial aviation innovation. And when the G-38 was publicly announced, it created a buzz among aviation enthusiasts and the general public. Newspaper headlines declared it the Giant Junkers, Air Titan, or the Flying Wing Hotel, conjuring images of luxury and technological mastery. No other aircraft had quite the same aura of futuristic daring. It was the sort of plane that made even skeptics turn their heads, wondering if such a feat was genuinely possible. Hugo Junkers himself remained steadfast in his belief that bigger was better, provided the engineering fundamentals were solid. His designs often blurred the lines between the conventional fuselage wing configuration and the concept of a flying wing. The G-38 was not a pure flying wing in the modern sense, but it definitely stepped away from the standard norms. In doing so, Junkers was laying the groundwork for futuristic aircraft designers to think outside the box, to push boundaries in shape, materials, and engineering solutions. The legacy of fearless innovation, backed by a record of successful aircraft, gave the G-36 project a sense of inevitability. People had come to expect bold feats from Junkers, and the G-38 was set to be the biggest and boldest yet. With decades of research and practical experience under their belt, and the enthusiastic support of Lufthansa, the stage was set for the G-38 to make its spectacular entrance into the aviation world. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Junkers G-38 was its enormous wing, which not only provided lift, but also housed passenger cabins, a feature virtually unheard of in commercial aircraft. To appreciate the design, it helps to take a look at the engineering challenges and the innovative solutions that Junkers employed. The G-38's wings were thick for 2 main reasons. It increased lift and the structural requirement of internal space. Thicker wings allowed for more robust spars, the longitudinal beams running from root to tip, which are crucial for handling aerodynamic loads. They also offer extra internal volume, which in the case of the G-38 was partially converted into small but functional cabins and compartments. Arranged like a multi-story home built into a single wing, these spaces required careful planning to ensure that the aircraft's aerodynamic profile remained efficient. The engineers also had to consider weight distribution, passenger compartments, stored luggage, structural reinforcement, and even crew rest areas that could not be placed arbitrarily. Every kilogram contributed to how the aircraft flew and balanced in the sky. Metal construction was a signature of Junkers aircraft, but the G-38 took it a step further. Instead of corrugated skins used extensively on prior models, the G-38 employed more advanced and, in some parts, smoother metal panels. This approach improved aerodynamics and elevated the aircraft's appearance. However, the methods for creating a stiff metal structure without the added benefit of corrugations required meticulous engineering. The result was a framework of duralumin ribs and spars, which were then clad with carefully shaped panels. Originally, the G-38 design featured 2 12-cylinder Junkers L55 inline engines in tandem on each wing, resulting in 4 power units in total. These inline engines were arranged so that one engine faced forward and the other was reversed, driving a pusher propeller. This tandem engine concept was somewhat experimental. Each pair had to be carefully cowled and positioned to maintain smooth airflow, while also ensuring adequate cooling. Later versions, particularly those designated for Lufthansa service, switched to more conventional engine configurations, often with upright inline engines or radial engines, depending on availability and performance requirements. In some design iterations, the G38 had as many as 6 engines, though not all units were operational. The complexity of these configurations often led to confusion in historical sources. But suffice it to say, the G38 needs lots of horsepower. Each engine was rated at hundreds of horsepower, meaning the entire aircraft boasted thousands of horsepower collectively. This power was necessary for a plane with such massive wings, a big fuselage, and the capacity to carry dozens of passengers, cargo, and crew. Engineers also had to tackle how to integrate control surfaces, ailerons, flaps, elevators, and rudders into a broad wing with a hefty fuselage. The G-38's large wings in particular demanded high lift devices to manage takeoffs and landings at relatively low speeds. Junkers was one of the first companies to experiment with advanced flap systems, ensuring that the G-38 could operate from available runways without needing impossibly long strips. Furthermore, the rudder and elevator surfaces were contained with a double tail fin arrangement on the rear of the fuselage. This configuration added stability to a plane that was, by any measure, unwieldy. Now, keep in mind, this was the 1920s and early 30s. Runway technology and airport infrastructure was still pretty rudimentary, so controlling a giant bird like the G-38 required all the aerodynamic finesse that Junkers could muster. Now, the landing gear had to be incredibly robust. Earlier planes were typically lightweight and didn't require overly sophisticated landing gear solutions. The G-38, by contrast, weighed tens of thousands of pounds. Its multi-wheel landing gear design distributed the load across multiple contact points to avoid sinking into soft fields, which was a real concern in that era. Although the G-38 did operate from established airports with firmer runways, the design still had to account for less than ideal conditions. Look, one can imagine the cringe on an engineer's face when asked to design a landing gear system that supports not just an aircraft's static weight, but the added dynamic forces during touchdown, all the while being expected to remain as light as possible. It was a daunting puzzle that made smaller aircraft's landing gear designs look comparatively straightforward. The combination of thick wings, metal construction, multi-engine power, intricate control surfaces, and robust landing gear was a grand orchestration of engineering expertise. It demonstrated what could be achieved when talented minds embraced a challenging vision. Many smaller details, like engine cowlings for cooling, the placement of radiators, if liquid-cooled engines were used, and the routing of control cables required dedicated solutions. For instance, ensuring that flight controls running through the thick wings remained accessible for maintenance was no minor task. In a sense, the G-38 was like a flying laboratory, pushing the envelope of what was possible in commercial aviation. Its engineering was a testament to Junkers' relentless pursuit of innovation. Even if some of the design concepts were later deemed impractical or replaced by more streamlined approaches in subsequent aircraft, the G-38 represents a milestone in aviation history, showcasing the heights of ambition in an era when air travel was still in its infancy. When you think of an airliner's passenger cabin, you typically imagine a cylindrical fuselage with rows of seats. The Junkers G-38 offered something entirely different. Yes, it did have the main central fuselage cabin, but it also had additional seating inside its thick wings. Yeah, this was more than just a gimmick. Junkers genuinely aimed to provide unique vantage points and additional space for travelers who wanted a bit of novelty alongside their journey. Overall, the G-38's interior layout changed somewhat between prototypes and operational models. Lufthansa's versions could seat anywhere from 13 to 34 passengers, depending on cabin configuration and the level of desired comfort. Now, at the time when many commercial planes were carrying fewer than 10 passengers, the G-38 was like a bus in the sky. Some sources suggest certain configurations could carry up to 30 or more passengers plus crew, making it one of the largest passenger-carrying planes of its day. The main fuselage cabin featured seats arranged in pairs or singly, with wide aisles and windows offering panoramic views. But beyond that, the distinctive highlight was the wing cabins, which were accessible via short passages leading from the main cabin area. These wing compartments provided not just seating, but sometimes also small lounges where passengers could sit facing outward through windows embedded in the wing's leading edge. Imagine looking straight out at propellers and the sweeping wingspan from a vantage point that no modern airliner can replicate. In the late 1920s and early 30s, passenger comfort on aircraft was hardly what we'd call luxurious by today's standards. Cabin pressurization, it was non-existent, so flights generally didn't climb too high, partly due to limitations in engine performance and the lack of pressurization technology. Still, the G-38 tried to make the experience as pleasant as possible. Seats were padded and spaced out to offer legroom, especially in the main fuselage cabin. Passengers in the wing cabins got that extra thrill from being so close to the aircraft's engine and the aerodynamic shape of the leading edge. Now, galleys or refreshment stations were rudimentary. You might have the stewardesses, or air hostesses as they were often called, serving simple snacks or beverages or even hot meals, though the logistics of in-flight service were far more primitive than they are today. Lavatories were also a feature, though with limited capacity. Everything from lighting to ventilation reflected the best technology of the day, but would probably be considered quite, Spartan by modern travelers. Despite these limitations, the G-38's interior was hailed as an aviation luxury. Newspapers and magazines often described the plane's interior with awe. Plush seating, side tables for writing or reading, overhead lighting, and surprisingly spacious compartments. The novelty factor of wing cabins further set the G-38 apart from the competition, drawing excitement from the public whenever it landed in an airfield. It wasn't all glamour, though. Those seated near or inside the wings had to contend with the noise and vibration of the engines. Some accounts from passengers reveal that the engine noise could be quite intense, depending on how close you were seated to the engines. However, the entire concept of airline travel was so new and exciting that many people just overlooked these inconveniences. For them, the thrill of flying and the bragging rights of having traveled inside the giant wing of a massive airplane were more than enough compensation. The G-38 also had separate quarters for flight crew and maintenance personnel. The flight deck was positioned at the front of the aircraft, elevated above the passenger area for better visibility. Mechanics could access some of the aircraft systems mid-flight, moving through crawl spaces inside the wing to reach certain engine components. This was a unique aspect of the G-38's design, the notion that minor repairs or adjustments could be made in-flight if necessary. Keep in mind, aviation technology was still developing rapidly, and in-flight engine troubles, they were not uncommon. Public reactions to the G-38 varied from sheer amazement to skepticism. On one hand, people marveled at the idea of strolling into an airplane's wing to find a seat or a lounge. On the other, some questioned the safety and comfort of being so close to the engines. Yet, overall, the G-38 garnered a reputation for setting a new standard of innovation in passenger flight. In an era where biplanes dominated the skies and transcontinental flights were still headline news, the G-38 soared as a symbol of futuristic travel. To get a clearer idea of what the G-38 was all about, let's examine some of the noteworthy specifications. Keep in mind that several variants did exist, and data can vary slightly between sources. The wingspan was about 44 meters long, about 144 feet. Some versions extended to about 47 meters. It had a length of about 23 meters, or 75 feet, and a height of around 7 meters, or 23 feet. Its wing area was up to 290 square meters. That's over 3,100 square feet, making it one of the largest wings for a land-based aircraft at the time. It had an empty weight around 18,000 kilograms, or 39,000 pounds, and a maximum takeoff weight, or MTOW. Did you know that it could approximately reach 24,000 or 25,000 kilograms depending on the variant and fuel load? I told you, this thing is a beast. Now, moving to the engine, the early versions used a tandem engine arrangement. Dual Junkers L55 12-cylinder liquid-cooled engines, each delivering about 600 horsepower. Some later versions used Junkers L88 engines, and modifications led to a range of 2,600 to 3,200 total horsepower. It had a cruising speed of around 160 to 180 kilometers an hour, or 100 to 112 miles per hour, and a max speed of over 124 miles an hour under ideal conditions. This might seem slow by modern standards, but man, it was impressive for such a massive aircraft in the early 30s. Typically, you get around 2,000 kilometers or about 1,200 miles of range, though real-world performance varied based on payload and weather conditions. Lufthansa often used the G-38s on routes within Europe, which rarely required more than a 2,000-kilometer flight in a stretch in a single leg. And it could typically house 5 to 7 crew members, including pilots, a radio operator, flight engineer, and sometimes additional mechanics. Flight attendants were also on board to serve passengers. As you can see, the G-38, it was no speed demon. Its strength lay in capacity, comfort, and range sufficient for mid-haul flights. It introduced advanced engineering solutions for the time, such as sophisticated flap systems and robust landing gear, proving that large aircraft could operate safely and relatively reliably. While those speeds and altitudes do seem modest today, the G-38 was a marvel in its era. It pushed existing engine and material technologies to their limits, and it gave operators a platform to explore new routes and passenger services. Lufthansa began operating the G-38 in the early 30s on prestigious routes connecting Berlin, London, and other major European cities. The aircraft immediately garnered attention wherever it flew. People would flock to airfields just to catch a glimpse of the colossal plane coming in for a landing, sometimes overshadowing other flights in progress. On commercial routes, the G-38 carried a blend of business travelers, government officials, and well-heeled tourists. Its novelty factor made it a desirable choice for those looking for a memorable airborne experience. Lufthansa promoted the G-38 as an example of top-tier German engineering, hoping to attract international clientele. Flight times might not have been drastically faster than those of other aircraft, but the promise of comfort and just the sheer spectacle of flying in such a big machine was a huge selling point. There were also incremental improvements made to the aircraft as operational data came in. Engine reliability was a constant focal point, and Lufthansa's maintenance teams worked diligently to keep the G-38's multiple engines running smoothly. Flight schedules had to account for slightly longer turnaround times, as fueling and servicing a giant plane was more involved than servicing smaller models. Beyond passenger service, the G-38 proved capable of carrying significant cargo and mail. In an era when air cargo was still in its infancy, the ability to haul heavier loads could make certain routes more profitable. Engineers at Junkers and Lufthansa recognized this potential, and the G-38 was occasionally refitted to accommodate freight in some of its cabins, particularly if passenger demand was lower on certain routes. Mail service was another important source of revenue. The G-38 could expedite international mail delivery, which was a big deal in the days before widespread airmail solutions existed. Airlines often secured government contracts to carry airmail, helping offset the operational costs of the big aircraft. As the 1930s progressed and Europe edged closer to geopolitical tensions, there was sporadic interest in adapting large aircraft like the G-38 for military or long-range reconnaissance roles. While the G-38 was never produced in large numbers to become a standard military transport, the concept of a large multi-engine plane, it was certainly not lost on military strategists of the period. The G-38's design elements, particularly the thick wings and robust airframe, informed later German designs that were used during World War II. Now, that being said, the G-38 itself did not see widespread militarization. Its role remained primarily commercial, but the lessons learned from building and operating such a large, all-metal plane would influence Junkers' future aircraft designs, including bombers and transport planes that served in various capacities. From a marketing standpoint, the G-38 was a goldmine. Posters, postcards, and promotional materials often featured the giant airliner, highlighting its advanced technology and luxurious appointments. Lufthansa used the plane's sheer size and wing cabins as an advertising hook, emphasizing that flying was no longer just about getting from one point to another, but doing so in style and comfort. Aviation enthusiasts from around the world found themselves fascinated by the G-38's design, spurring a spike in press coverage. Magazines ran exposés detailing the plane's interior layout, engine configuration, and flight performance. As a result, the G-38 became one of the most recognizable aircraft of its day. Not unlike how modern audiences might feel about maybe the Airbus A380 or Boeing 747 when those first entered service. It symbolized national pride for Germany in the era of possibilities for commercial flight. Operating such a large and experimental aircraft, it was not without its troubles. Maintenance costs were high, and the G-38 required runways that were both long enough and structurally sound to handle its weight. Engine issues could be complex to address. Additionally, while passengers marveled at the novelty of wing cabins, the extra complexity in the airframe meant more potential points of mechanical failure. There was also the question of profitability. Despite its capacity, the G-38's operational costs often outweighed its earnings on certain routes. As technology advanced, airlines began gravitating toward more efficient designs that offered better speed, altitude performance, and reliability. For all its grandeur, the G-38 was soon overshadowed by aircraft that weren't necessarily as large, but were economical to operate and could fly faster or higher. Still, for a few glorious years, the G-38 was the flagship of European commercial aviation. It demonstrated what could be done when ambition met engineering know-how and solid airline backing. Lufthansa's experience with the G-38 paved the way for future expansions in their fleet, eventually leading them to adopt more modern designs as the 1930s transitioned into the wartime era. The Junkers G-38 had a short but spectacular lifespan. Only a couple of airframes were built, each undergoing modifications and improvements. They performed commercial flights for several years, wowing passengers and curious onlookers. But as the 1930s wore on, newer aircraft designs emerged with better engines, improved aerodynamics, and more comfortable cabins. The combination of advancing technology, economic pressures, and shifting priorities spelled the end for the G-38. Large experimental aircraft from this era often had accident records that reflected the growing pains of aviation technology. While the G-38 did experience incidents like engine failures, ground handling mishaps, and at least one crashing, these were not excessively high compared to other aircraft of its size and complexity. However, each incident was costly and could involve lengthy repair times, further questioning the viability of the design. One of the G-38 airframes was lost in a crash, highlighting the inherent risks of pushing technological boundaries. Thankfully, not all incidents were catastrophic, and some were minor enough that the aircraft could be repaired. Yet for Lufthansa, each substantial maintenance or repair bill cut deeper into the bottom line, making it harder to justify the G-38's place in the fleet. By the late 1930s, Germany's aviation industry was increasingly oriented toward military requirements. Companies like Junkers, Heinkel, and Messerschmitt were channeling resources into the development of fighters, bombers, and other military aircraft. Commercial aviation took a back seat, and lavish experimental airliners like the G-38 had little room to flourish. When World War II began, resources were severely constrained, and older commercial aircraft were often repurposed or scrapped. The G-38, for all its innovation, didn't fit neatly into any urgent wartime role. Larger, more specialized transports or bombers were already on the drawing board and were considered more useful for the war effort. Although some aspects of the G-38's design may have informed later military transports, the aircraft itself was a relic of a hopeful era that was rapidly fading. Ultimately, the G-38 airframes were either destroyed by accidents or lost in wartime bombings. A handful of parts and fragments ended up in museums or private collections, though no complete G-38 survives to this day. This is a tragedy for aviation historians, as seeing one of these magnificent aircraft in person would have been a reminder of the boundless optimism that once propelled aviation forward. The G-38's brief operational life shouldn't overshadow the significance of its contributions. By demonstrating that large, all-metal, multi-engine passenger planes were feasible, Junkers lit the path for future aircraft like the Boeing 314 Clipper flying boats and, eventually, the post-war airliners that would crisscross the globe. Although overshadowed by designs that followed, the G-38 remains a monument to imaginative engineering, fearless experimentation, and the early attempts at creating a luxurious passenger experience in the air. The Junkers G-38 remains a remarkable chapter in aviation history, showcasing how ambition and engineering prowess can converge to create something that defies expectations. Although its time in the skies was relatively short, the impact that it had on aircraft design and the imaginations of those who beheld it lives on. I hope you found this exploration both entertaining and enlightening. Hey, look, learning about these aviation milestones offers us a deeper appreciation for how far we've come, and much is still possible. If you enjoyed this journey through the world of the G-38, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more in-depth looks at aviation legends, modern aircraft reviews, and all things that take to the skies. Safe travels, everyone!